Today I'm speaking with Kevin Maxwell. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah.
Welcome to my channel. And this is my
Mhm.
first time speaking with Kevin. Kevin and I are not acquainted until just a few minutes ago, but Kevin, I've seen some of his work with MythVision, which I follow a lot. And anyone who knows me and my channel knows that I love MythVision and what Luther and Derek and everyone else there are doing. And I saw some of your work with them. I saw some of your posts, and I just thought I'd love to touch base with you, kind of hear more of your story. And just to give a little bit of a bio for Kevin, he lives up near Calgary in Alberta, Canada. And do you say the word "a" by the way at the end?
Uh, Maybe. I guess there's that expectation around Canadians. I don't really find myself saying it, but
I'll be listening for it
maybe.
tonight. Um,
Okay.
and you went to a Christian school for high school, and then you went to a polytechnic for architectural technology, which is awesome. Sounds like you got some really cool background there with those skills. So you were
Mhm.
for a while an architectural designer, and at this
Yeah.
point, is it correct you went back to school to study psychology?
Yeah, I've taken my first year now, so I took the semester off because of the pandemic and everything right now, but I might go back here in the winter. We'll see what happens.
How's that going? Is it what you expected to be studying and learning? And
Well, the first year is kind of like you're only actually learning psychology about 10% of the time. I think it's
okay,
for like like freshman year. It's like I'm being thrown in with a bunch of like 18 and 19-year-olds again, and I think they're the way the school system's set up is kind of just meant to like get you learning about all kinds of things in the first year. So I think it's not till like maybe the second or third or fourth year that you actually get to dive in more into the social psychology. Psychology itself is so broad,
mm,
it's kind of hard to get into what I would want to study, which is more like the mind control or social influence
yeah.
sort of stuff. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I must admit I'm jealous of that in the sense that I've been thinking more and more as I process my deconversion and as I look at other people that are still in it,
Yeah.
just how much psychology plays a big role in people's
Oh, yeah.
willingness to believe, to stay, to not listen to other perspectives, etc. But we'll dive into some of that for sure. Just to finish up what I know of you, and I'll ask you in a minute to put
Mhm.
some more on the table for what I don't know about you. But you
Right.
would call yourself an astrotheologian, which I would say is awesome, and I'm on that path myself.
Hmm.
Nowhere near where you are with it, I'm sure, but on that path, learning a lot. And
Hmm.
I was just speaking this morning with Bill Darlison, so I'm definitely
Yeah.
learning from some of the big guns out there. You would consider yourself a philosopher who syncretizes preterism with ancient astrology. And I look forward to asking you in a little bit what preterism is.
Yeah.
And then you do also focus a lot on other world religions as they look at astromythology or astrotheology. And so at that point, that's what I know about you. Could you tell us a little bit more what else you're up to these days?
Well, I'm always exploring. So like my personality likes to explore new things, new parts of myself, but a lot of it is to do with like the principles of myself. I go to like a book club, and we started a book on the Celtic wisdom with Anam Cara, which is like soul friend. So that's kind of what I'm doing, but I'm always have like 10 books that I'm like halfway through, so it's not like I'm like doing one thing at a time, but I've realized that I'm more of an emotional being than a rational being. So I usually kind of go with the flow, and I think there's a certain wisdom to that. So, but I'm also like experimenting with balancing out different areas of my life that I didn't have really necessarily in the past. Like my social life is probably more alive than it was in the past. As an introvert, as somebody who had maybe subconscious phobias and like emotional trauma that I was dealing with at an early age. Right now, I'm kind of like learning what it means to own my emotions and explore parts of myself that I was ashamed about maybe in the past, and I think there's healthy ways to do that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
awesome. In terms of your background going into your bigger story, I have gathered that you did grow up in a Christian home. Is that right?
yeah. It's always been a pretty liberal Christian home, I would say.
Okay.
It's not. It wasn't. We didn't like talk or sit around talking about the Bible or anything really like that. It was more like I was introduced to this idea of Jesus when I was like 6 years old, and then we kind of went to church sometimes. And then as I've gotten older, was kind of, I read the Bible on my own. I think my parents gave me a Bible when I was born and stuff. But yeah, it was in my teens. I kind of read it for myself. Started to look into it more when I got out of college and found this church in Calgary. And then I kind of got sucked into sort of a Pentecostal, sort of charismatic church movement in 2014, which led me eventually interested into what the Bible was about later, which got me into all these cults, and then finally into eschatology, and then out into psychology, which is what we're kind of where I'm at today. So
you've had a huge gamut of influences there, it sounds like.
Oh yeah.
Were you exposed in any of them or multiples to the idea of just of the simple gospel, the idea that you have a sin issue that separates you from God, you need atonement through the blood of Christ, and by placing your faith and trust in him, you would receive the covering for your sins and be right with God?
Well, yeah, that's kind of always been the idea, that is like, well, what does that mean, or what is that true, or because I probably heard that when I was like, I went to church, whatever, when I was probably 10 years old or something, right? I was in Calgary. I grew up in Calgary, actually, and we went to West Side King's Church, which is like maybe a little bit more free, but not non-denominational. Maybe it's always been kind of that way. So my dad's kind of become more and more liberal as time has gone on, and I've always been around him and had been influenced by him. But he's always a more pragmatic thinker than I've been. I've kind of been exploring theories. That's kind of how I am. So it's like, so the simple gospel's always kind of been there, but it's always been like, okay, what does that mean? What am I saved from? Like, there's just always more questions you could ask.
Were you taught much as a child, either by your family or by the pastor or Sunday school teacher, that you were a sinner?
Well, yeah, it was not directly. It was more when I was looking more intensely into the Bible, then this cult came to our door, and they were super like legalistic looking. So it was about 9 months in 2016 where I was actually studying this more fundamentalist sort of doctrine, trying to understand what the heck they meant. And I think subconsciously I had phobia around like what that means for me and who I am. And I think I even got kind of depressed because it made so much sense the way they told it to me and stuff like that. And then,
what was the cult called?
Well, that was called World Mission Society Church of God. So they're a Korean Bible cult, and they're kind of like a doomsday cult as well.
Wow.
But
you're the first person I've ever heard say that that they've ever been in one of those.
Yeah, sort of like that. Because they believe this Korean lady's God, basically. So that was pretty intense. Like, I haven't been around or been to a lot of really fundamentalist churches because I've never really had that background. So there are certain types of those fundamentalist groups. I think they're not as common around where I live as they might be in the States more. So
with the cult, were you just investigating what they believed, or did you feel like you were actually part of it for a while?
Well, I think kind of both. It was like, at first I was investigating, and then I was going to their meetings, and I felt like I was part of their community, and I'd say for maybe 5 months I felt like I was part of that. But at the beginning and end of that, it was more investigating, right? Because like I would still hit the streets and try to convert people with them and stuff like that. But the whole time it was like, it made sense in my head, so I was doing it, but I didn't really believe it in my heart, because I had this previous experience like with the charismatic sort of church, which was more intuitive and spiritual, and like it was more to do with the miracles and learning like that. So it was like it was like the character of God didn't fit in with what they were teaching at some point. So.
Do you have any idea how big that the World Mission Society Church of God, how big they are? Is it just a small group there, or is it all over?
Well, they say they have 2.5 million members. I think they're exaggerating a little bit, but I do believe they're worldwide because they have videos and stuff. But they had a church in Edmonton with 200 people, and one in Calgary with like a small house church with 30 people or something. So yeah,
even if they were doubling their numbers, it's 1 million people that believe that she is God. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Do you know?
There's like Yeah, there's like 70 different of these false Christs who came out of the Korean movement, mind control movement in the 60s. I think it was part of this political movement
Hmm.
after World War II and stuff. So,
I don't think I've heard about that. If you don't mind just taking a second to tell us what you know about that. What is the mind control movement from Korea?
well, I haven't looked into it too much, but they were doing like mind control experiments and stuff. And that's like where you have like this movie called The Experimenter, who does like these authority tests. It's like they bring this guy into a room and they tell you to zap somebody in the other room, and it's like two-thirds of the people end up going to, like, the person almost dies because they're just trying to obey authority. And so it's like people have this authority issue of if somebody is seen as an authority figure, it's much easier just to obey that authority figure for people. It's much more comfortable than to think for yourself or become the hero, you can say. Um, but
So did this lady actually do miracles that people attested and said, we saw her do blah, 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 and,
well, there
bring
was
someone back to the life or something?
well, there was one or two stories about something she did, but it didn't really hold up for me because it was like we were on the phone with her and we asked her for so many people to show up for this Passover feast, and then those people didn't show up, and then it was our fault for not having enough faith. And it was like, okay, well, already had experience with like the miraculous before, so like if God says something's gonna happen, it's gonna happen, right? So it was like one more thing where it was just it was too weird. Um, but yeah. Anyway, this was just like one little church in like everything I've been studying. It's like at the same time, it was just because there's and they didn't like make room for the unknown. You could say that it's like oh yeah, we have all the answers pretty much, and it's
Hmm.
just psychologically it's not healthy.
I think you're the first person that, like, I know that Christianity itself is a cult. I
Mhm.
wouldn't have ever called it that when I was a Christian, of course, but I know now that it is a cult. But
Yeah,
for the groups that I would have called a cult, and sorry for the noise, my kids are making some noise in
yeah,
the background there, they're playing.
yeah,
But our little girl is about 9 months old. She's at that point where she just wants to squeal and squeal and squeal.
yeah,
So she's learned how to figured out how to learn how to project her voice and be as
right,
loud as she can.
yeah,
Um, but in terms of people that I would have called a cult
hmm,
back then, like, you are the first person I've talked to that's been in that. I've got to just ask, did it seem? I mean, it seems not to sound in any way. Hopefully, it doesn't sound mean, but it sounds like it would have been obvious, like almost before you even started. Like, this just doesn't sound right. Or like, were they really good at deceiving people? And did you think that they might actually have the truth, or were you just trying to glean some? Did you feel like they were wrong from the start, but you're just trying to see if they
well,
had any nuggets of
yes.
truth?
Well, it was weird at the start because I was in an apartment with two other guys, and we all went to this little bit of Pentecostal church called Experience Church.
Okay.
And there was actually this group actually came to our door, and wasn't actually I wasn't even home actually when they came. It was my roommate who went to this Experience Church with me, who agreed to do a Bible study with them, and they planned it for the next day, and I was there the next day. So then it was like they came in the room, and I almost felt bad for them, but I just want to explore things. So it's like was really curious. I thought I could even help them actually, and that's like my weakness is like I think I can help somebody, and then I get drawn into something. It's like I think I could be a friend to this person who has these issues, and I could try to fix them. And it's like you get drawn into that, and then you end up doing something that they're doing, and that's kind of how it was at the beginning. So it was like um, and because it's just you start going to their meetings, and at first you have an argument, and they're actually impressed by what I had to say, which was like criticizing them. But then it was like by the time you get to the third or fourth doctrine, it's like okay, it's kind of like game over because it's just they're starting to paint this complex puzzle that takes so many things, it assumes so many things that are just floating out there in the church, and it's building upon that. And it's like if you're not fact checking like when books are written and stuff, they're painting a picture of history and they're using the Bible to do it, and
Hmm.
they're creating this thing where it's like God inspired all this stuff to happen in history, and now ta-da, out at the end of the door is our church, and all the other churches are Babylon, and the Catholic Church is the mother of the cults of Mother Babylon, of little Babylons. It's like,
Hmm.
and you just have that alpha beta influence, and it's like they're just selling you on it, and we're constantly being sold on stuff.
Yeah.
culture. So it's like it's hard to discern or take a break from those influences to think for yourself. And if you're going to their church 3 times a week and like 3 times on a Saturday, and it's hard to take a break from that and think for yourself and think critically, especially as a young person, I would say. And that's why there's a lot of younger people in these groups too.
Hmm.
Um,
It's fascinating. Admittedly, I've had not had much experience, no experience myself with a group like that, and I haven't talked to too many people. But that sounds fascinating.
mhm.
I'm very curious. I have to look that group up and see if they have any videos online, just because I'm
Yeah,
fascinated by what they do. It sounds really bizarre, but
it is. It's
maybe it's
there's one website is the True WMSCOG, which stands for the World Mission Society of Church of God, and they're just trying to defend all their doctrines, and they use that website for their members, and they show it's like, oh, look at our nice website, we're this big church, we're defending our doctrines. So yeah.
Well, bring us to the next step. So you got out of that.
Yeah.
You moved on.
Yeah.
What's happened between then and now?
Well, right after that, I had a lot of questions. It was kind of like I finally got separated from them, and I bought a house in Three Hills. And so I put this question out there, and then it's like my friends were still the people from the Experience Church, which is more of a non-denominational, but they still have their list of beliefs or something on their website. But it's so one of the worship leaders basically reached out once I posted on Facebook about like, okay, what do I believe about eschatology or the end times now? And he sent me a video to this partial preterist series on YouTube, which was Jonathan Welton, and it was called the Last Days series. And I started watching it with my mom actually, and she ended up buying like all of his books and stuff. But that started me down this journey down the eschatology route, and then I understood that there's like 4 different kinds of eschatology. And so for about from the end of 2016 to about 2017 or 2018 was I slowly moved from partial preterism into full preterism, which is basically everything was fulfilled within the first century, and not just part of the Bible, but the whole Bible was fulfilled in the first century.
Okay, this is something I wanted to ask about later. Can you tell me a little bit more? Preterism means the Bible is fulfilled, meaning what?
Yeah.
What was fulfilled?
Well, it's like the opposite of saying futurism. So it's preterism. So it happened in the past, and
what specifically happened in the past?
Basically the Matthew 24, Olivet Discourse, and the Book of Revelation. So all
the second coming or whatever, the return of Christ.
So there's like the big 3. Partial preterists put the big 3 in the future and everything else in like the first century.
Okay.
At the destruction of Jerusalem. And so the big 3 are like the second coming of Christ, the last judgment, and is the resurrection, right? So a partial preterist will put that in the future, and they'll say, well, but everything else was about the destruction of Jerusalem, and it's just metaphorical language about that.
Right.
Full preterist will say, well, that was actually all. You can't separate those doctrines or elements. You actually have, because if you read it in context and you pay attention to some of this language, it's actually said it was going to happen within that generation in the first century. So that was about the destruction of Jerusalem, and it was more metaphorical. So as I began to understand that, the more metaphorical it became. So, and you get there by looking at the time statements in the Bible, like from even Deuteronomy, and talking about the end of the Old Covenant, and you study that, and then so you study when the covenants happen. And you look at the language around the timing of all that.
So just for, again, I'm sure that there's a lot more to this, and I may be oversimplifying it, and I apologize if I am.
Yeah.
But
Right.
So if Christ came back, are we living in what dispensationalists would call a tribulation time, like, or what's happened since Christ's supposed second return?
Well,
like, what are we in now?
I'm not a preterist anymore. But
right, I mean, what would they have said?
The preterists would say that basically we're living in the eternal new covenant, or a continuing. There would be like a continuing sort of evangelism, or carrying out of the gospel. So it'd be like his government shall have no end. So it's the continuing government of Christ, basically. Even though it causes some problems with the language from what I've looked at now, about the second coming and how Christ would hand the kingdom back to the Father and stuff like this.
Gotcha. I got to ask the crucial question that's on my mind at this point.
Yeah.
What do you believe today? Do you believe in that at all, or are you still okay?
I think at some point it became too ridiculous, and it was like, okay, just there was enough common sense and me learning about my reality that it was like, okay, this is actually all like mythology.
So you didn't just leave preterism, you left Christianity?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I try to tell people the Bible is like basically a metaphor about the cycles of the universe from an ancient cosmological perspective. And that's what ended up happening to me by looking at the time statements in depth. Because it ended up lining up with cosmic cycles that the ancient people were observing.
Yeah.
And that's like what the end of the age was about. So
I do want to ask more about that, but before I ask some of those questions, could you tell me just some of the influences in terms of either people, if you remember, people that you studied,
right.
whether books, people that wrote books or have videos, like what
Right.
got that ball rolling and really took you into the depths of that would be astrotheology, right? Astrotheology or mythology.
Right.
Who did you go to learn some of that? And like what was it though that took you from just studying it generically to, because leaving Christianity is very, like, there's a lot of people that would, and I've learned more and more about this, than people that would say, I used to be a conservative fundamentalist Christian, literal Christian, and whatever that means, there was a 6,000-year-old earth and, talking snake, and really there was a Noah and a flood, blah, 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 that's all real. But then there's this whole spectrum of other Christians that would say, well, yeah, but we give some credence to evolution, or we give credence to a lot of it as metaphor. And then you have, of course, the really liberal Christians, maybe, who go to just a, there's to a conservative Christian, these liberal Christians aren't even really Christians. It's just fluff Christianity, and not even that. Because it's kind of like doctrines of demons in that sense, because if you're going to be a church, you're not preaching the gospel, you're not even doing fluff, you're doing something very dangerous. You're misleading people. So this whole spectrum of people, but it sounds like you actually went all the way from what you had believed about Christianity in a couple different ways. You actually just left it all the way. So could you tell us about the influences you had, and then what was that process, the final process, like when you put all those pieces together?
Right. Well, it's like I've looked at quite a lot of different things, but like even universalism was in there while I was looking at preterism and stuff. But like when it came to astrotheology, it was somebody presented to me Genesis 49 and the blessings of Jacob, and how they represent the ages of the zodiac, and how the 12 tribes of Israel are the 12 signs of the zodiac. And they were quoting basically Santos Bonacci on this debate group between full preterists and these Israel-only preterists, which is basically the whole Bible's for Israel, and which is kind of common sense if you just think about it from a whatever or common sense point of view. But so then it was like I started watching Santos Bonacci videos, and he's kind of like talking all over the place. But for me, it's like he's almost like he's trying to express this secret, and he's kind of speaking in metaphors almost. It's hard to understand him if you watch one of his videos.
I've watched. He's over my head in about 30 seconds.
Yeah. But you can watch like one of his videos. Like my favorite one is his older videos where he's talking about astrotheology, and there's one called Know Thyself. And I think I watched it like 5 times. I learned something different every time I watch it, because a lot of it is symbolic, and he's using pictures, and I'm a visual learner as well. So it's like I can see the picture and the symbolism and the cycle of the universe that these people believed in, and then you can make connections. But it was that, and then he's recommending books the whole time he's doing it. So it was like there was Reverend Robert Taylor in the 1800s who wrote a book on astrotheology and how the Bible's like this fable, and he points out these contradictions about like Judas Iscariot in the Gospel of Luke and in Acts and stuff. And just through that, you start to meditate on that for a couple of years. You start to see the language from a different perspective. You can like redefine words, and you can make sense of these contradictory things in the Bible. And yeah, it's just,
Yeah.
just a few of those start to happen, and it's like, oh my God, everything flips upside down. It's like, this isn't quite history, and history wasn't really the point to begin with, from what I've learned. This is like more the kingdom within you, and the relating to the cosmos or the unknown. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it was like,
It's fascinating to think about how, like, who was it that did this? Because when you look at it, when you're a Christian,
mhm,
you know, the fundamentalist Christian, you're obviously looking at it from that perspective of its literal history.
yeah,
It seems like when you first escape and you're like, oh shoot, this wasn't real, this wasn't, none of this is all mythology.
yeah,
You kind of have this response of, you know, I'm crying bullshit, you know, I'm done,
right,
I'm out. But when you go back to it, like you step away a little bit, you know, take a breath and kind of, okay, what happened here? You know, what was I in? What
mhm,
was this thing? Because you know, most people do what some people walk away and I'm done, and they don't care what it was.
yeah,
They don't care to read or talk about Christianity anymore. But
mhm,
a lot of us go back to it and say we want to understand, what were we in? What happened? What was this cult?
yeah,
And as you go back to it and you dive into the stuff you're talking about, you realize, yeah, what I thought was, you know, maybe a discrepancy, two, you know, two different stories they were trying to merge. You look at it deeper and you're like, wait a second, there's something else going on here. And you're not thinking of it now as like, this is, oh, this is divine, this is beautiful. But just, especially astrotheology, you're like, wait a second, you know, Elisha and the 42 children, the two bears, you know, Jesus, the wine, you know, Jacob and Esau, the twins, you know, the
yeah,
man with the water pot. You're like, wait a second, this is astrotheological stuff. And then you start weaving all the other stuff you could do, such as the midrash and the, you know, gematria, and you
right,
start you throwing in Homer, and you're like,
mhm,
wait a second, these guys were a lot. These weren't, you know, backwoods hillbilly goat herders. These were
no,
people that knew their
yeah,
mythology, they knew their Greek, they knew their Homer, they
yeah,
knew a lot of. I mean, there's a lot of, you know, they knew the
mhm,
speaking here more about the New Testament, but they knew their intertestamental apocrypha. They knew Enoch. I'm
yeah,
finding, you know, dozens and dozens of quotes from Enoch in the New Testament. I mean, they knew these books, and they somehow wove them together very intricately in a way that if you
mhm,
don't know those other books, you wouldn't know it.
yeah,
You just think this is a story, and
yeah,
there is a beauty to it. It's, you know, you have to see it from the perspective of mythology, and to appreciate it. But
mhm,
you know, because to a
yeah,
fundamentalist, that's blasphemy, so to speak, and to someone in on the outside that's just like fed up with it, you're like, that's stupid.
mhm,
I don't care what they were doing. But
yeah,
once you kind of try to just let it just say, I don't care who responds to it with their different belief levels. I just want to understand, what was this? Just, that's my only question, is what was it?
yeah,
And you see things arise that are stunning.
yeah, oh
Do you
yeah.
remember some of the high points of the astrotheology that stood out to you at all as you got into that?
Well, it's like I just began looking at it, to look for what was helpful or what was realistic from like, if they, okay, because it was like you said, I was looking at finally looking at the context, the actual context, where it was like there was a Stoic philosophy going on, there was this astrology going on, it was super popular at that time. There was the seven liberal arts of the Greeks going on, and like Pythagoras was coining these terms like cosmos, and what does that actually mean? So so that just leads you into reading these books on astrotheology, like Jesus Christ, Son of God, SUN, and then you look at the sacred geometry of like the circle, and then you look at comparative theology, and you need that context, and then you can see like the archetypes of like the sacrifice or the twin brother, and you see it in other myths around the world, and it's like, okay, this was obviously not something that was like isolated or just sprung out of nowhere. It actually, it seemed to spring out of everywhere at once, all at once. And but like I remember one thing was reading Cicero, and he wrote the book, The Divine Nature of the Gods, and he talks about the constellations, and he
Hmm.
talks about how he understood how the stars were actually living things, and how since they're moving they must be alive, and then so I just started to see like the logical progression of how like the metaphors in the Bible could be written, and how they're personified, and how Jesus was like a personified sun god, and how like he sits with his friends in a circle. Well, the circle is symbolic, and then it's just so it's like until you have the understanding of the symbols and the ancient astrology or the perspective on the universe. So I read a book on like Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, which is the first century astrology, and how basically it's everything in the stars is like the stars are obeying the commands of the gods basically, and that's like the law of Moses right now. It's like, yeah, to obey the commandment is to follow the path of the fixed stars now. So it's just all those little pieces. It's not like it was just once, but it was just every little piece you start to see this puzzle arise, and it's and really it's the study. It's like in Ephesians 6, like honor your father and mother so that it may go well with you and you may live long in the land. It's like, and that relates, all of a sudden connects to this word for what God meant to the Egyptians, which is function. So it was like, yeah, they were trying to understand what's functional from a psychological and an astrological perspective. And there was this mirror going on, like in the book of Job, or even this term, because it's the Bible always talks about heaven and earth. It doesn't talk about heaven and hell. In Christianity today, we talk about heaven and hell because it's the alpha beta influence. It's supposed to scare you into our doctrine. But heaven and hell was like, this is heaven and hell's down here. It's your body. And then what's the new heaven? Okay, because I thought heaven was like eternal and the same, or some place you go to after you die. But then there's an old heaven and there's a new one. Okay, what does that mean? And so all of a sudden heaven is this changing thing, or like a living thing now, because it's changing. So it's like, so then you realize that you just, if you meditate on the zodiac, all of a sudden stuff makes more sense. It's like heaven is like this, the personified body of the zodiac going through and becoming a new heaven. Is it going through the seasons now? It's like, so there's just a lot of this amazing stuff that's like explodes with life if you understand the ancient view of the universe. So it's like,
so it's not necessarily that we're talking about anything to do with current day astrology, but we're saying that the ancient,
it's a language. Yeah,
yeah,
it's the language that helps you redefine all this stuff in the Bible and in any religion, really, because it's all of it seems to come from this. Yeah.
And it was really like, it wasn't even just a study in the sense that you could go to a college today and study astronomy.
No.
This was certainly that, but it was much more. This was their worldview, as you said.
Yeah.
They would look up and they would see the stars, they would see changes in the zodiac and the equinoxes, and they would look at this stuff, and certainly the stuff that was more dramatic, such as the eclipses and all that, and they would and comets, and they would see this as deities and gods and demigods doing different things and trying to explain it. Certainly the stuff that affected the earth directly, but just trying to explain these. And some of them were stories that went back for centuries, and some probably even millennia, that got syncretized, got woven in and changed. Some of the deities got renamed, where it was one name in one culture and the next culture said, oh, that's the same god, so we're going to associate the stories. But they wove them together, and then when you get to stories like in the Bible, it doesn't suddenly turn into history. The same people with the same worldview are doing the same thing, and so you get to like Joseph and this dream of the 11 sheaves bowing down to him, and it's like or Jacob and Esau, the twins, and it's endless examples, and you suddenly are like, okay, there may be some snippets of historical events that they may have woven in some places. That's hard to sometimes tell. But over and over and over, they're just going through these cycles of telling star stories, and I love the one that just strikes me so much. It's so much clear as an example is Elisha and the bears. Have you ever heard a Christian try to explain that one literally? No, it's amazing the way they try to turn that into something like, oh, this really happened and God just cursed kids. And do you remember this story?
Well, I just know the bears are Canis majoris and Canis minoris, so I can't recall the story exactly. No, I probably read it, but
he calls of course Elisha has a bald head. Elijah, his predecessor, has not a bald head, and he goes in a chariot up in the sky. So
Right.
pretty obvious there. And then Elisha with a bald head
Right.
comes and they make fun of him. So he calls out two bears
Yes.
to kill specifically 42 children, to curse the children. And it just, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor have 42 star doublets. And it's like, this is clearly
Right.
astrotheological.
Yeah.
And what's amazing to me is when you get to someone like, Bill Darlison, John Lumwall, and Acharya, they start to add to these stories a depth that just, it blows you away. Did you get any influence from Acharya's work at all? I'm just curious.
Yes. Like first I found out Santos Bonacci, and then it's like I ran into Derek, who's kind of going through the similar journey I was. And then
Derek Lambert.
yeah, and then he kind of introduced me to this other guy, Jacob Mazeroth or whatever his pseudonym on Facebook. But then he introduced me to more Acharya S, and I started reading like Caesar's Messiah a little bit, and then like the Roman provenance theory and whatever. But yeah, it was Acharya S. I got like a few of her books now, and I've been reading through like Christ in Egypt and the Christ Conspiracy, and it's been really helpful to understand. She has like 900 sources or quotes in her books. It's like really intense reading, but it's like wow.
Do you have any favorite astrotheological stories from the Bible that really stood out to you as you figured out what they were doing?
Oh yeah, I think I like the Exodus story the best because I feel like everything's kind of copied off the Exodus story a little bit. I think the Exodus story just explains it the best because it's like the Exodus of the soul almost. It's like and of course it's like it starts out with Moses, who's like copied from like the story of Sargon or whatever. It goes, so it's like it has this kind of history behind it. And then you see the second Exodus theme in the New Testament, so it's like this major underlying thing. um, and and then everything is kind of connects to that. So it's, and there's that language of between John and Jesus, which Acharya quotes as well in her documentary, which is, "He shall increase and I shall decrease." Well, she just makes the point like two humans wouldn't say that to each other. It's like if you're going to have a contract, you just sign the contract and say, okay, here, it's yours. But since there's this thing called the covenant transition period in preterism, it's like that should be your first clue that there's this astrological sequencing going on behind the scenes. And you start to look at when the feasts are, and it's like an agricultural metaphor for these points on the zodiac that they were celebrating new life. And it's like Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega. Well, that's the beginning and end of like the ecclesiastical Jewish year, where it's like spring equinox, and that's like, but yeah, with the Exodus, it's you can see how the seven feasts are like a story of the Exodus through the year. So that it's like you go out and they come out of Egypt or whatever, which is like the southern half of the zodiac, which is like this prison of slavery, which is the winter months or something. Or maybe it's the summer months. Sometimes it gets flipped around, right? And then or they go out into the wilderness, which would be again the southern half of the zodiac. You've brought in your food, but you have to go through a wilderness period to enter the promised land again. Well, that's the new year. That's the new season. And it's in mythology. The future is the place where there's abundance and fruit and stuff like this. And
of course, Moses can take him right up to the edge, but he can't go in.
Yeah, but that's a big clue. Is like there's another book, Origins of the World's Mythologies, and he's comparing the sequencing in myths to find out where they came from, and it goes back 130,000 years. And in the Laurasian myths, it's like they have a sequence of beginning, middle, and end. Well, that's like the Bible. It has like a beginning, a middle, and an end of the world, or the cosmos. And then you find out, well, that's like the beginning or middle and end of the great year, of the Plato's great year, which has to do with like a scientific cycle actually. And then the time statements just work out with the end of the age 2,000 years ago. So it's like, yeah.
Yeah, we're almost to Aquarius, right? Well, could you to kind of wrap up the focus, I wanted to take us back to your story now. How long ago did you actually, come to the realization and conclusion that the Christian worldview, the Christian belief system is mythology?
Yeah.
And was that difficult for you in the sense, like some people I've talked to, they're like, you know what, I deconverted over a couple of months to years. It was slow. I can't even say there was a day where I was like, I'm done. I'm out. It was like they just looked back at it at some point and said, I think at some point in the last, year, I must have deconverted. I'm definitely not a Christian now. Other people like myself, it was very specific. There was a day where it all came flooding in. What was that like for you? And was it shocking? Was it difficult? It sounds like you've been through enough changes and enough upheavals with some of your belief systems that I would imagine it wasn't as hard. But what parts, if there were difficult parts, what was the hardest thing about it? And then after that, if you tell that part, can you also tell us a little bit about where you are now with it all? In other words, some people kind of leave Christianity but still believe in some kind of higher power, some kind of afterlife. Where are you with all that now as well?
Well, for me, it was it was kind of like maybe a 6-month transition or something like that. It was like, and it was actually when I found out like the Bible was only for Israel. And but then I found out later that Israel was like this metaphor, but it's like, but it was, I think it was like 2017 or 18, maybe 2018. And I realized that the time statements basically made it so that even if this thing was historical, it doesn't really matter because it's like everybody was saved already. It was like, so what the heck would it have to do with me? So then I kind of went into a bit of a depression about that, and maybe a bit of disillusionment or whatever. But I think I needed to go through that, and it was almost like if I hadn't let myself go through that, I wouldn't be able to see things in a new way like I see them today. So it's like, but I had to have that safe space for myself to let myself go through that, if that makes sense. It was like I had to trust that things would go well for me and I would be okay, even if what I understood about God was completely wrong. It was like I still so there was like this. I still had a subconscious feeling of love or something within me that felt like I was going to be safe, and even though it was like intellectually, it was kind of like a death of truth. And it's like I like to think, like Jordan Maxwell says, Jesus is a metaphor for truth. And of course, Jesus dies and rises, and it's like, so that's kind of a cycle of personally, where it's like it was a death of truth, but a death of truth is required for a new truth to rise up, and then you actually see the beautiful, and you're going to be remembering things from your new truth that you're not necessarily going to understand when you're standing before that event. But you have to. It's almost like when you're talking to a cult member. The psychologists tell you to ask hypothetical questions. It's like, well, what if, like, hypothetically, what if you're wrong about that? Or and to even like say the word hypothetical, because that creates this safe container for them to be sincere with you, and hopefully that you're a good enough friend with them that they feel safe to show integrity with their thoughts. And and then it was kind of this transition, and then it was like. Well, I just started to redefine everything for myself, so that I wouldn't just be in resistance to everything all the time.
Yes, that's such a good way to put it.
Yeah. So
it's like you're not just out there saying, "I reject you, I reject you, I reject you." It's like you're not, as someone else just recently said, not my concept, but saying instead of just fighting the darkness, you're actually lighting a candle. You're actually bringing some new light to this story as opposed to just bashing everyone else.
Well, yeah, I think Carl Jung says what you resist persists. So it's like I don't want to constantly be fighting with evangelists. It's better for me to ignore that and focus on something healthy that's going to make me feel good about myself and my life and where I'm at with my stage of psychological development and all that stuff. Yeah.
It's kind of a silly parallel. I know Richard Dawkins doesn't really care to debate creationists, and the illusion he used was he's like, I'm not going to debate someone over the stork theory of reproduction. Like that's not, it's so ridiculous. That's not how babies are made, by storks delivering them. And it's like, I'm not going to give credence. And it's the same thing. When you give it so much attention, it does tend to kind of make
Hmm.
people think, well, let me just keep, let's tell all the sides of this story. And it's like, no, there's not really a story there. The one thing I do think that's interesting is someone like Bill Darlison
Yeah.
and John Lunwall, other people that look at the astrotheology, and perhaps, I don't know if Santos Bonacci did this too, or Acharya did it, but they
Hmm.
go back to a lot of these stories where they kind of, it's like they go on two passes. They kind of debunk it, and then they go back to it and say, now what can we learn from it? Which is interesting to me. And it's a bit of a learning and a bit of an educational experience to say,
Yeah.
okay, I thought we were debunking this to the point of saying it's garbage. And they kind of pulled me back and said, no, you're missing it. We're not debunking it to say it's garbage. We're debunking the initial interpretation of it, but we're
Yeah.
saying there's something else there to learn from. So go back and learn from what you should, which is kind of what I think you alluded to with, it's a new cycle. Um,
Yeah.
I'm curious though where you're at with things at this point. Do you believe that there is a God? Do you believe there's an afterlife? I know, not to use the word belief too much, but just
Yeah.
if you have to land somewhere, do you lean
Right.
more towards theism or atheism? Do you lean more towards there being an afterlife or not?
Well, I don't know. I'm kind of agnostic, sort of gnostic, maybe about some things, but it's like to answer that question, you have to give a definition of God, and you have to give a definition of like the afterlife or whatever. But
Yeah,
it's like, um, but yeah, like God to me is if I'm gonna like integrity and sincerity has become my highest truth, really. So it's like to me, God is an authoritative term for like the truest part of me, and I'm like an expression of the universe. So it's like maybe I'm a bit of a pantheist, or an autotheist, where it's like if I'm going to take responsibility for my actions, and be virtuous and have peace in my life and function in a society, um, to me it's good to have this maybe idea of first cause, and that I'm part of that first cause, because then I can really take ultimate responsibility for my actions, and
yeah,
maybe have more peace in my life and own my emotions and own my relationships, and I think there's like something healing there for it. I don't know, it can depend on the person, the personality type, but for me, I'm an introverted feeler, so it's like I have to go with what feels good and feels in harmony with what the rest of my belief system. So, and it's like I'm not going to try to believe what somebody else believes. I also don't need anybody to agree with me, um, uh, but it would be nice if there was something realistic there that was between us that we could all learn from as well. It's like,
yeah.
yeah.
Find some
So,
common ground as well.
yeah, I'm always willing to be flexible on some of the mysticism or even this language in the Bible. Like, to me, it's just symbols, and how are we interpreting those symbols, like for our emotional body,
Yeah,
and are we listening to our body? Are we and but yeah, I would say like, okay, there is a God if he is like the source of myself, and he is like the first cause maybe of the universe or something like that, because there has to be some sense making there. um, but I don't think there's like a God that's like separate from myself. It's like that's just being dishonest with my consciousness. I feel like, um, so it's like, so yeah, sure, there's a God, but it's like, how are you defining him, I guess? And you have to define him if you're going to say that. So yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's a good point. I think people like yourself and others that I've spoken to even recently, you all do a good job of kind of bringing, I think,
Mm.
some balance. I was just thinking of that Star Wars balance to the Force, but
Yeah.
I'm not going there. But just
Right.
the balance to the perspective of I went very much to a very strong naturalism
Right.
perspective of just I just don't think there's anything. I think that we don't understand yet where the universe came from, and I think if we can keep from self-destruction as a race, and can get to the point where we're kind of living in a space traveling kind of existence someday and in future generations, and
Right.
traveling and getting technology improved every generation, I would
Right.
suspect that we'll have our minds blown by what we discover about where the origins of the universe, where it came from, and where we fit in the much bigger picture of it all.
Mhm.
But if I have to land somewhere, I tend to land more on materialism. I don't think
Yeah.
there's anything. I think we're
Mhm.
very advanced
Mhm.
primates, and
Right.
in the sense that we wouldn't look at a primate, not per se the primates today, but just the primates that we came from, evolved from. But
Right.
if you were to look at one of them, say, whoever was significantly before the Neanderthals, you'd say, well,
Right.
did they have a soul? Do they have an eternal future with God? Was God looking after them?
Mhm.
Well, what about the primates before them? Say 50,000, 100,000 years before then, or whatever it would be, a million years. What were the ones that were less like primates and more like whatever came before the primates? Or did they have a soul? And it gets into these questions of
Mhm.
if we try to make ourselves super spiritual, it
Mhm.
feels like it divorces me from where we came from as a species. And
Mhm.
I try to always remember, like, I am a really amazing person, and
Mhm.
I'm free to make my life whatever I want it to be. But whenever I get too far from saying I am a really advanced primate, I start to feel like I'm over spiritualizing myself and putting something that's not there. Like, we are really cool math. We're really amazing math, and we never want to discount that.
Mhm.
But I don't. I tend to be on that side of more naturalism. But I feel
Mhm.
like people like yourself, and other people that I recently talked to,
Mhm.
they kind of say it's almost like there's not like a contradiction. Like, no, you're wrong. It's more like
Mhm.
a yes, but, or like, and yet, and then you add something. It's like, yes, we are descended from the primates. We are amazing, but we are just this, but, and then you add some other dynamic, and it does it. I mean, I think there's part of us that feels like there's something more to life than
Mhm.
just you are here to try your
Mhm.
best to live and to try your best to reproduce and to try your best to thrive, and then just go back to being dust. It feels like
Yeah.
there's more to it, and I think that sometimes some of these stories, and I tend to think there's not more to it than that, to be honest.
Mhm.
But and in some ways, to me, that's freeing because there's no determinism. Like, I'm not
Yeah.
determined to make a difference for some greater cause. I make my own cause,
Yeah.
but I still think that some of the points that people that would see it very differently, they bring to the table some very good aspects of it. So it sounds like you would probably lean to the other side of that equation. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, it's more for me is like, okay, I'm gonna be, if I'm gonna own who I am, which is my personality type, which is my Christ, you could say, like I exist in this place between the known and the unknown, and that's like in psychology it says it's if you're healthy, you have one foot in what you do know and one foot in what you don't know, because that's like being realistic. So like, and that I feel like that's enfolded in these myths as well, is like, um, it's taking into account the unknown,
Yeah.
and it's, but then the unknown implies the known, and it's like, because I know something, and it's like, and what I know is like, well, it's just my pure awareness is I'm observing this reality, and there's this kind of mirror going on there, where it's like there's my consciousness, and then there's like this universe, and that's like this, I think that's what the myths are trying to express, is that relationship between those two things. And uh and that's, so for me to say, well, what's most common is like my consciousness is really, that's, to me, that's God, and that's in a relationship with what I know, which is maybe the universe, which is like this maybe a feminine role. So it's like, for me, God has been like redefined as something that is to do with my consciousness, and that helps me basically cope with death and stuff as well, is because when I die, I'm not going to be identified with my body, and I feel like there's more peace for me there.
Yeah.
So that's kind of me taking responsibility for my peace and my well-being when I say that, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. Understood. Well, could I ask, just to give a little nod to MythVision? I know you've been involved with them. What have you done with them so far? And could you just give a little bit of, to use an old Christian expression, could you give a
Yeah.
testimony as
Yeah.
to what they've done to kind of help you in your journey through all these discussions?
Yeah. Well, I like to tell my friends I came up with the name because we were all, me, Luther, and Derek basically chatted online and came up with this name, MythVision. And uh, but basically, I was kind of there at the beginning, helping coming up with some of the intros, and I did a couple interviews on my own with a few people, and they interviewed me
That's
for
awesome.
one time, and I kind of got busy, and Derek had more free time, I think, and he's more the extrovert anyways, so he's just kind of taken it and ran with it. Um, and I think Luther is writing a book, so he's kind of taking a bit of a break. But MythVision was for me is like, okay, what's behind these myths? What was going on behind all this huge influence that is Christianity today in the West, or even all the religions? And so that's what, to me, like MythVision means, is like what is behind the veil. And that's my personality too, is break down the false idol and find out what the truth is, basically. And and so that's basically like how it got started. I think it was actually started out like the Water Boys,
Hmm.
and it was Derek and Luther, I think. And Luther has like went to college for communications, or he was a professor, so he's already up and running and like doing some of that. And but then they kind of asked me to come on because I was into this astrotheology stuff at that point too. And
So
so
cool.
yeah, and then I did a little bit of artwork for them because I'm a bit creative like that. So
Yeah,
anyway, so yeah, that's
that's
basically
awesome.
the story. Yeah.
I gotta say, I appreciate then what you're doing, especially since you were there at the genesis of
Mhm.
it all,
Yeah.
and anything you've done to moving forward. Because ironically, they weren't part of my deconversion.
Right.
They meaning the all of you all and the
Mhm.
videos. It's weird when I think about it because they're now such a part of my perspective on so much of this.
Right.
But for whatever reason, I didn't stumble across them really. To the videos until after I left and really began to investigate it all. But it kind of feels like they were part of it, even though they weren't, because so much of what they're diving into was
Yeah.
what I was kind of coming to my own conclusions on a much more broad and generic level, probably, but without all the depth of information. And
Right.
but it feels like one of the things that I love about what MythVision does, and um, just the passion that Derek has, which is so strong and so clear. It's like he's got this drive that it's inspiring. But it's
Mhm.
it's not just that he wants to understand him, for his own sake, though he does, but it's like he really has this drive to help other people have all the information. And I feel like that was one of the biggest frustrations for me as I left Christianity, was realizing there is so much information that they never told us. And it's like, if you really believe that you have nothing to be ashamed of, you have
Mhm.
nothing to hide, then put it on the table. Tell us where this book really came from. Show us, tell people that it's got, dozens and dozens and dozens of quotes from the book of Enoch in the New Testament. Tell us it's got quotes from the Apocrypha all over the place. Tell us it's quoting, Aesop and other Greek philosophers. Tell us it's quoting Homer. Tell us
Yeah.
all of this stuff. Put it on the table, and then we'll make up our own minds whether we want to believe or not. But don't just tell us this party line and say you
Yeah.
must believe it just like us. And that was just, I was so frustrated when I realized that that's what my Christian life had basically been, is people saying, this is, blinders on, this is how it must be, and if you don't agree with us, you will burn in hell. And it's
Mhm.
like, I think people, it's like almost like a deserving issue. Like, people deserve to have the full spread. They don't have to agree with me, they don't have to be an atheist, but
Yeah.
people definitely deserve to have all the information that I got. And I feel that passion too, to start to put stuff out there. And
Yeah.
I'm working slowly through some of that, but just to give people, let them make up their own minds with all the information. But I appreciate that you helped get that started.
Yeah.
I'm curious, as a final question, what's next on your plate in terms of subjects that you have kind of maybe heard about but haven't dove into too deeply yet, or anything that you want to write about or make videos on? Like,
Mhm.
what's on your agenda for the next couple of years?
Well, I started listening to Ken Wilber. I don't know if you've heard of him, but
No.
he's he talks about integral psychology, and he mentions so he's integrating all these different sorts of developmental psychology, and he's combining it with like spiritual awakening traditions in the East, and bringing them together, and showing us that there's all these different kind of forms of consciousness that they don't tell you in the West in school. Like maybe there's 10 different ways of you can experience life, and you only get really taught two of them in school or something like that.
Hmm.
So So for me, it's like I want to bring an awareness of all these different ways you can experience life, and I want to study the developmental psychology to help speed up that process. So that has to do with more meditation. I think that's the only scientifically proven way to speed up the developmental process. Um, and talking about the stages of faith and how I think it would be good if every religion could say that every religion has all these stages of faith. And that's part of growing up, actually, is like you start out at more of an archaic level and you go through like this magical, and then you take the myths literally, and then all of a sudden you're more rational after that. And then after that, it's like, okay, maybe there's multiple truths. And after that, maybe you're integrating everything to come up with something healthy. And it's like, so for me, it's like I want to continue going to school for psychology, and that might turn into some counseling thing, and I might turn into like incorporating like the psychology of the Bible or mythology in general, and talking about the archetypes and the symbols of that could really be like applied to one's life in real ways. And that's what I want to explore more, probably.
That sounds awesome. I would love to see that when you get to the publication phase of it. That
Yeah.
sounds really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, the archetypes is that's a whole subject too we could dive into sometime. But yeah, that was a big one for me, realizing that was a big part of what we're looking at. Yeah, the pagan parallels too. That's not to open a can of worms, but just pagan parallels, the mystery cults. Man, oh man, there's so much they didn't tell us. So much.
Oh yeah.
Well, is there anything that I didn't ask that you'd like to talk about, or any subjects that are on your mind tonight?
I don't know.
Gotcha.
I've just been exploring so many things, like reading the Rig Veda and different philosophy things, but I just want to remind people to basically take a personality test and find out how you get your energy, and then you can be centered, and you can explore all this stuff maybe from a place of more energy or from a place of peace. Like I can't think straight if I'm exploring something, if I'm trying to achieve some goal, as easily as I can if I'm just doing it for fun. And that's has to do with how I get energy. So like I'm more introverted. So for me, it's been helpful to understand my personality type in that area. So
yeah, that's an interesting point. That's awesome. Yeah, I will admit I haven't taken one of those in a long time. And the last time I took one, it was in the context of a church looking for your spiritual gifts. So I think it's time for a real one.
Yeah, it might be a time.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate you being willing to share a little bit of your story and what you've been thinking about, and it's a little bit of your journey. I know there's probably a lot of little details in there that we didn't get to, but I appreciate you being willing to take us through some of the highlights and just what's been on your mind. And I really appreciate, again, what you've done for MythVision through both the beginning and more recently. And just keep it up. Let us know what's on the agenda for the future, and look forward to hearing more from you.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. It was nice meeting you.
Right. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay.